Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen.
A man walked into a sheriff's office one day, and what he claimed shocked everyone in the room. On February 14th, 2026, a man walked into the Gentry County Sheriff's Office in Stanberry, Missouri, carrying a 1970s Polaroid camera and wearing clothes that looked like they came from a 1990s thrift store. He told the deputy at the front desk his name was Mike Marcum and that he needed to report himself as a missing person. The deputy, a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Chen, who had only been with the department for 3 years, pulled up the missing persons database and found no active case for anyone named Mike Marcum. The man insisted he disappeared in 1997 and had just returned. Chen thought she was dealing with either a mentally ill person or someone playing an elaborate prank, so she called her supervisor. That supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, had been with the department since 1989, and when he heard the name Mike Marcum, his face went pale. You'd be shocked at what happened next. Mike Marcum first appeared in public consciousness in January 1995 when he called into Coast to Coast AM, Art Bell's late-night radio program covering paranormal topics. Marcum told Bell and millions of listeners he'd accidentally discovered a way to manipulate time while experimenting with Jacob's ladders in his garage in Stanberry, Missouri. Jacob's ladders create visible arcs of electricity between two electrodes. During one experiment, Marcum saw what he described as a vortex form in the air, and when he tossed a small object toward it, the object vanished and reappeared seconds later in a different position. He became convinced he'd created a distortion in space-time. Marcum's homemade equipment wasn't powerful enough to create a stable effect, so he made a bad decision. Working part-time maintenance for local businesses gave him access to the St. Joseph Light and Power Generating Station in King City, Missouri. Over several weeks, Marcum stole 6 large electrical transformers from the power company. Each weighed hundreds of pounds and handled massive amounts of current. He transported them to his rented house and wired them together in a configuration he believed would work. On January 10th, 1995, Marcum powered up his contraption. The surge caused a localized blackout affecting several hundred homes in the King City area. Power company technicians traced the drain to Marcum's address and called police. Officers found his house filled with industrial electrical equipment, wires everywhere, and scorch marks on walls. The police report describes 4 transformers in the back bedroom, one connected to the fuse box on the back porch, and lines leading to what looked like a large TV antenna in the yard. Marcum was arrested and charged with theft. He spent months in jail before posting bail. During this time, he became a local celebrity. News spread through Missouri about the man who caused a blackout trying to build a time machine. Most people treated it as a funny story, but Marcum was completely serious. He did interviews explaining his theories about electromagnetic fields, space-time distortion, and moving objects through time. In February 1996, Marcum called Coast to Coast AM again, telling Art Bell he was building a second time machine using legally acquired parts from industrial auctions. He was 30 days from completing it. He claimed he'd successfully sent over 200 items through it, including small animals that came back alive and unharmed. His next step was to go through it himself. When Bell asked if he was afraid, Marcum said fear was less important than proving time travel was real. Then in March 1997, Mike Marcum disappeared. His landlord noticed that Marcum hadn't paid rent for 2 months and that mail was piling up outside his door. The landlord entered the property with a sheriff's deputy and found the house abandoned. Most of Marcum's equipment was gone, but there were strange marks throughout the interior. Scorch patterns on the floor and walls suggested there had been an enormous electrical discharge, far more powerful than anything a residential electrical system should be able to produce. The concrete floor in the garage had a circular pattern of discoloration, as if something extremely hot had been placed there for an extended period. Windows facing the garage were cracked from what appeared to be a pressure wave. None of Marcum's personal belongings remained except for some old clothes and a few books about theoretical physics. The deputy filed a report noting Marcum appeared to have abandoned the property. Since there was no evidence of foul play and no family members came forward, the case went nowhere. The Missouri State Highway Patrol never officially listed him as missing because there was no indication of violence. Urban legends started growing. Some claimed Marcum had succeeded in building his time machine and traveled to another time. Others said he'd been killed when his equipment malfunctioned. Coast to Coast AM, listeners theorized he'd been abducted by the government because his research threatened classified military projects. Now here he was in 2026, standing in the Gentry County Sheriff's Office, looking almost exactly the same as he had in photographs from 1997. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who'd been a rookie deputy back when Marcum disappeared, pulled the old case file and compared Marcum's current appearance to the photographs from his 1995 arrest. The man in front of him looked like he'd aged maybe 5 years instead of 29. His hair was slightly longer and grayer, and he had some additional lines on his face, but he should have been 57 years old based on his birth date. Instead, he looked like he was in his early 30s. Webb took Marcum into an interview room and started asking questions. months. Where had he been? What happened after he left Stanberry in 1997? Could he prove he was really Mike Marcum? Marcum explained he'd activated his second-time machine on March 18, 1997. The device used a ring of powerful electromagnets with laser equipment mounted at specific points to create a rotating electromagnetic field. The lasers fired in a synchronized sequence that made light spiral around the inside of the ring. Marcum had based his design on theoretical work by physicist Ronald Mallet, who'd published papers about using rotating light to create frame-dragging effects that might allow time travel. Mallet's theory, inspired by Einstein's general relativity, suggested that a sufficiently powerful rotating beam of light might twist space-time enough to allow temporal displacement. Marcum told Webb that when he activated his machine, the space inside the ring started to shimmer like heat waves rising off hot pavement. Then a dark spot appeared in the center, growing larger until it looked like a tunnel or vortex. Marcum had planned to send more test objects through first, but something went wrong with the equipment. The vortex started expanding beyond the ring, and the electromagnetic field became unstable. Marcum realized the machine was about to catastrophically fail, and in a split-second decision, he jumped through the vortex before it collapsed. He experienced what he described as falling through absolute darkness, while feeling like his body was being pulled in every direction at once. Then he hit solid ground, and the darkness vanished. He was lying in a field about half a mile from where his house had been, but the field looked wrong. The grass was shorter, the fence line was in a different position, and when Marcum walked toward where his house should have been, he found an empty lot with a for sale sign that was weathered and faded. He made his way into Stanberry and immediately noticed things were different. The gas station where he used to buy cigarettes had been replaced by a charging station for electric vehicles. The grocery store had new signage and automated checkout systems. Cars on the road looked sleeker and quieter than he remembered. Marcum found a newspaper outside a coffee shop and saw the date, February 12, 2026. He jumped forward almost 29 years. Webb listened with growing disbelief, but something about Marcum's demeanor made him keep listening. Marcum said he'd spent the last 2 days trying to understand what happened. He'd been sleeping in an abandoned building, afraid to approach anyone. He still had the Polaroid camera from 1997, with developed film showing his equipment, workspace, and several shots of the vortex effect. Webb examined the photos and noticed the film stock had a manufacturing date, November 1996. Webb called in the FBI. This case was too strange for local law enforcement to handle alone, and if Marcum was telling the truth, it had national security implications. Federal agents arrived within hours and took over the investigation. They isolated Marcum in a secure location and began a thorough examination of his claims. They took DNA samples to compare against any biological evidence that might exist from 1997. They searched for dental records, medical records, anything that could definitively prove or disprove his identity. They brought in physicists from the University of Missouri and from federal research laboratories to evaluate his technical descriptions of what he'd built. DNA analysis came back first. Marcum's genetic profile matched DNA found on personal items from his abandoned house in 1997, stored in the county evidence locker. His fingerprints matched his 1995 arrest. Dental records showed his teeth were in the same condition as a 1996 exam, with no additional wear from 3 decades. Medical examiners performed tests determining biological age. Telomere length analysis, cellular markers, bone density, and organ function all pointed to a man in his early 30s, not approaching 60. Physicists who interviewed Marcum were initially skeptical, but became increasingly interested as he described his machine's design in technical detail. His approach bore striking similarities to theoretical models that researchers like Ronald Mallet had developed, but Marcum had added his own innovations based on his understanding of electromagnetic field interactions. He described using a specific frequency for his lasers and a precise timing sequence for the electromagnets that created what he called constructive interference patterns in the space-time fabric. Some of the physicists admitted that while his terminology wasn't standard academic language, he was describing concepts that aligned with cutting-edge research into closed time-like curves and frame-dragging effects. One physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory set off the record that Marcum's description was consistent with classified research into temporal mechanics that had been ongoing since the 1980s. The story leaked within a week. A sheriff's office employee talked to the Kansas City Star, and the article exploded globally. News organizations descended on Stanberry, population 1,200, suddenly at the center of the biggest science story in history. Marcum became the most famous person on Earth overnight. The federal government moved quickly, transporting him to an undisclosed location to debrief and verify his account before allowing public access. Scientists around the world reacted with a mixture of excitement and extreme skepticism. The physics community had long known that Einstein's equations allowed for the theoretical possibility of time travel, but most researchers believed the energy requirements would be impossibly high and that practical time machines would remain science science fiction forever. If Marcum had actually accomplished temporal displacement using equipment he built in his garage with parts from industrial auctions, it meant the barriers to time travel were far lower than anyone had calculated. Multiple research teams began trying to replicate Marcum's design based on the technical details that had leaked from FBI interviews. Universities and private laboratories started building ring laser systems and testing whether rotating electromagnetic fields could produce measurable effects on spacetime. The religious and philosophical implications were equally profound. If people could travel through time, what did that mean for concepts like free will, causality, and the nature of reality itself? Theologians debated whether time travel contradicted religious teachings about the linear nature of creation and God's plan for humanity. Philosophers wrote papers about the paradoxes that might arise. What would happen if someone went back and prevented their own birth? Could the past be changed, or were all attempts to alter history doomed to fail because they'd already happened? Marcum's case raised questions that humanity wasn't prepared to answer. Towards the end of February, the federal government released a statement acknowledging that Mike Marcum had been positively identified using multiple verification methods and that his biological age appeared inconsistent with the amount of calendar time that had passed since his disappearance in 1997. They stopped short of confirming that time travel had occurred, instead saying the case remained under investigation and that multiple explanations were being explored. But everyone could read between the lines. The government was admitting something extraordinary had happened, even if they weren't ready to say exactly what. Marcum was allowed to do one press conference, held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He appeared nervous but determined as he stood in front of dozens of cameras and hundreds of reporters. He read a prepared statement describing what he'd built, how he'd activated it, and what he'd experienced during the transition. He said he had no idea whether he could replicate the effect or whether going back to 1997 was even possible. He admitted he'd been reckless and that his experiment could easily have killed him. But he also said he didn't regret it because proving that time travel was real mattered more than his personal safety. When reporters asked if he planned to build another machine, Marcum said that decision wasn't his to make anymore. The government had made it clear they would be heavily involved in any future research into temporal mechanics. The scientific community remained divided. Some researchers insisted there had to be another explanation for Marcum's extended youth and missing 29 years. Perhaps he'd been in cryogenic suspension, or maybe he'd lived in isolation somewhere and was lying about the time travel to cover up whatever he'd really been doing. Others pointed out that his DNA, his dental records, and his biological markers all supported his account. Kenneth Olam and Alan Everett, two physicists who'd written papers criticizing Ronald Mallett's time travel theories, published a detailed analysis of Marcum's case. They acknowledged that something anomalous had clearly occurred, but argued that Marcum's descriptions of his machine didn't align with the requirements for creating a closed time-like curve as understood by current physics. Ronald Mallett himself, now in his 80s and professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut, gave several interviews about the case. He said he'd been contacted by FBI scientists who wanted to know whether Marcum's design could theoretically work based on Mallett's own research. Mallett admitted he was shocked that someone had apparently succeeded where he'd spent decades trying to prove the concept was viable. He said Marcum's use of synchronized lasers and electromagnets to create a rotating field was more sophisticated than Mallett's early proposals, and if the government's verification was accurate, it meant humanity was on the verge of a revolution in physics that would make the discovery of nuclear fission look trivial by comparison. Governments around the world began scrambling to understand the implications. If time travel was possible, it could be weaponized. Someone could go back and assassinate political leaders, sabotage historical events, or steal technological secrets before they were developed. The United Nations Security Council held emergency sessions to discuss whether international treaties were needed to regulate temporal research. China, Russia, the United States, and the European Union all announced they were launching their own time travel research programs, though none of them confirmed whether they'd already been working on classified projects before Marcum's case became public. Marcum himself seemed overwhelmed by the attention. After a while, he told his FBI handlers he wanted to go back to Missouri to try to live something resembling a normal life. The government agreed on the condition that he remain available for ongoing consultations and that he not attempt to build any more time travel devices without federal oversight. Marcum returned to Stanberry, but the town had changed. Tourists came from around the world to see the place where time travel had been invented in someone's garage. The empty lot where Marcum's rented house once stood became a pilgrimage site, with people leaving flowers, notes, and offerings. The local government debated whether to turn it into an official memorial or science museum. Marcum gave one more interview, this time to Coast AM, the radio show where he'd first talked about his experiments back in 1995. The current host, George Norrie, who'd taken over after Art Bell's retirement, asked Marcum what he'd learned from his experience. Marcum said the most important thing was that the universe was far stranger and more flexible than people realized. Time wasn't the rigid, unchangeable thing we experienced in in daily life. It was malleable, subject to forces and conditions that humans were only beginning to understand. He said his biggest regret was not documenting his work more carefully before he activated the machine, because now he couldn't remember all the specific details of his design. His memory had gaps, possibly from the stress of the temporal transition, and he was working with physicists to try to reconstruct as much as possible. The case of Mike Marcum changed everything. It opened doors that humanity had assumed were locked forever. And, of course, research institutions were reporting unusual results from attempts to replicate aspects of his work. None had achieved temporal displacement yet, but several labs documented measurable distortions in local space-time when they activated high-powered rotating electromagnetic field generators. The physics journals were flooded with papers proposing new theories, new models, and new experiments. Marcum's return after 29 years had proven that the impossible was merely the not yet accomplished, and scientists around the world were racing to figure out how to turn time travel from a one-time accident into a reliable and controllable technology. Meanwhile, Mike Marcum tried to adjust to living in a world that had moved on without him. His parents had died while he was gone. His few friends from 1997 were now middle-aged, with families and careers they'd built over 3 decades. Marcum was biologically still a young man, but he was culturally and chronologically displaced, a visitor from the past trying to live in a present that felt like an alien world. He spent his days working with government scientists, trying to remember details about his machine, answering the same questions over and over, submitting to endless medical tests and psychological evaluations. At night, he stayed in a secure apartment in Columbia, Missouri, watching the world try to process what his experiment had revealed. He'd proven time travel was real, but the cost had been higher than he'd ever imagined, and there was no machine that could take him back to undo what he'd done. What do you think? Could a man really disappear for decades and somehow return without aging the way he should? Or is there another explanation that we simply have not figured out yet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.